Napoleon Bonaparte, one of history's most iconic and controversial figures, was at the height of his power when his empire stretched across much of Europe. But by 1815, his reign had crumbled. Exiled to the remote island of Elba after his first abdication, Napoleon had been removed from the political and military stage. However, his story wasn't over. In a turn of events that would make history tremble, he escaped the island and returned to France. His second reign, though short-lived, would be filled with battles, betrayals, and a catastrophic defeat at Waterloo that sealed his fate. But by the time he was captured again and exiled to the island of Saint Helena, Napoleon had already entered the twilight of his life. Saint Helena was a small, remote island in the South Atlantic, chosen for its isolation and the difficulty in escaping from it. For a man who had once been the ruler of most of Europe, this was a bitter end to his journey. Saint Helena, with its windswept hills and harsh climate, would become the place where Napoleon would spend the last years of his life, cut off from the world, surrounded only by a small circle of loyal followers and a few officers who had been ordered to stay with him. In the early days of his exile, Napoleon's health seemed relatively stable. His days were spent in a modest house called Longwood House, a far cry from the palaces and grandiose surroundings he had once known. Napoleon, ever the strategist, tried to maintain a sense of dignity, even in the face of his profound fall from grace. He spent long hours writing, dictating his memoirs, and discussing history with those few who remained by his side. His mind, sharp as ever, focused on his legacy. He spoke often of his glory days, remembering his victories and the magnificent empire he had built. However, despite his physical appearance seeming relatively well-maintained at first, Napoleon's health began to deteriorate. The harsh environment of Saint Helena, combined with his isolation and the emotional toll of his downfall, started to take its toll on him. At the age of 45, the former emperor was facing not only a nation's rejection, but the undeniable reality of his physical decline. Though the exact cause of his illness is still a matter of debate among historians, it's widely believed that he suffered from various health issues during his time in exile, the most significant being stomach pain and digestive problems. As the days wore on, these problems grew worse, and his once vibrant energy faded. At times, Napoleon seemed to be in denial, continuing his work as if nothing had changed. He still considered himself the emperor, a title that had become nothing, more than a sad reminder of the grandeur he had once enjoyed. It wasn't long before Napoleon began to show signs of depression. His days were filled with a sense of isolation and frustration. The magnificent life he had once known seemed like a distant memory, and the man who had commanded armies across Europe was now a prisoner, helpless against the forces of time and illness. His closest companions, many of whom were once loyal officers, struggled to understand his mental state. Some believed he was simply adjusting to his new life, while others feared that his health was in serious jeopardy. Napoleon's physical symptoms continued to worsen. He complained of pain in his stomach, fatigue and difficulty in keeping up with his normal activities. He was frequently seen clutching his abdomen in discomfort, his face drawn and pale. The medical care he received on the island was limited, and at times the doctors assigned to him were either ill-equipped or lacking in the expertise to deal with his symptoms. Though the emperor had a few loyal doctors, none could provide him with the cure he so desperately sought. His most trusted physician, a man named Francesco Antommarchi, tried various treatments, but nothing seemed to have any lasting effect. The lack of proper medical care made matters worse. Over time, Napoleon's body began to weaken. His once proud stature shrank, and the vigor that had defined his earlier years was slowly replaced by weakness and frailty. But it wasn't just Napoleon's physical health that began to decline. His mind, too, seemed to be affected. His thoughts were increasingly consumed by his past, by the events that had led him to this point. His obsession with his legacy became more pronounced. He would often speak to his companions about the greatness of his reign, insisting that history would one day recognize him for his contributions to the world. He clung to the idea that he would be remembered as one of the greatest rulers of all time, despite the ignominious end to his empire. He was a man obsessed with his own memory, even as his health failed him and his reality crumbled. At times, Napoleon's memories of his past victories seemed to haunt him. He would talk about the campaigns he had led, the soldiers who had fought for him, and the empire he had built from nothing. His eyes would light up with passion as he recounted the battles, even though the physical strength to carry on his legacy was long gone. In these moments, he seemed to forget the bitter truth that his empire was now a shadow of its former self, and he was a broken man, stranded on a distant island. Despite his declining health, Napoleon continued to maintain his role as the leader of his small circle of followers. He often made decisions regarding the administration of the island, though in reality, he had no power to enforce them. His authority was limited to the small group that had accompanied him into exile. These men, for better or worse, became his closest companions in the final days of his life. As the months went by, the pressure of his isolation began to wear heavily on Napoleon. His once proud figure was reduced to a man burdened by his own mortality. He struggled to find purpose in a life that seemed to hold little meaning. The whispers of his impending death grew louder, and with it, the fear that his legacy might be lost forever. The man who had once held the future of Europe in his hands now found himself fighting a battle he could not win, the battle against time itself. Throughout this period, there was little news from the outside world. Napoleon's communication with Europe was strictly limited, and his isolation from the world only deepened his sense of despair. His mind wandered back to the days of his glory, but he found no solace in these memories. Instead, they seemed to mock him, reminding him of the life he had lost and the power that had slipped through his fingers. As Napoleon's health continued to deteriorate, his condition became more serious. His stomach pains grew worse, and he became increasingly weak. His physical appearance began to change. He lost weight. His skin became paler, and his once chiseled features grew gaunt. Napoleon's emotional state mirrored the decline of his body. He became more withdrawn, his conversations shorter, and his once bold personality subdued. The thought of his final days on Saint Helena seemed to torment him. He was no longer the emperor who commanded armies and sat upon a throne. He was a sickly man, far from home, surrounded by the remnants of a life he could no longer control. As his health continued to deteriorate, Napoleon's isolation grew even more profound. The palace, once a place of power and grandeur, now felt like a prison to him. His companions, though loyal, could do little to alleviate his suffering. With each passing day, the possibility of death loomed larger. The island, with its harsh winds and desolate landscape, seemed to reflect the state of his life, a life that had once been full of promise and glory, but had now withered into a quiet, lonely existence. Napoleon's final days on Saint Helena were marked by a sense of resignation. He had fought many battles in his life, but the final one, the one against his own body, was one he could not win. In the weeks that followed, Napoleon's health reached a critical point. His abdominal pain intensified, and he became increasingly bedridden. His once imposing presence was reduced to a frail figure lying in bed, barely able to speak. Even his once legendary willpower seemed to fade as he faced the inevitable. The Emperor of France, the man who had once dreamed of dominating Europe, now found himself at the mercy of a disease he could not control. The end was near. Napoleon's decline was swift, and the island of Saint Helena, once the place where he had hoped to rebuild his life, became a suffocating reminder of his mortality. By the middle of 1821, Napoleon's condition had worsened significantly. He could no longer hide the extent of his suffering, and those around him began to realize that his time was running out. His once vibrant personality, the fire and drive that had propelled him to greatness, had been replaced with a somber resignation. Even the sound of his once commanding voice had grown weak, reduced to little more than a hoarse whisper. As his condition worsened, Napoleon's memories of the past became even more vivid. He often spoke of his glory days, recounting stories of battles won, cities conquered, and empires built. His companions, though sympathetic to his plight, found themselves powerless to ease his suffering. It was as though Napoleon himself could no longer escape the weight of his own history. His memories, once a source of pride, now seemed like chains that held him to a past that could never be recaptured. The weather on St. Helena, which had once seemed tolerable, now seemed a constant reminder of his plight. The winds howled through the island, carrying with them the sound of the waves crashing against the rocky shore. Napoleon, confined to his room, spent much of his time staring out the window, lost in thought. His health was deteriorating rapidly. His stomach pain had become unbearable, and he could hardly keep food down. It was clear that his body was failing him in a way that even his formidable will could not overcome. Napoleon's medical care, though diligent, was insufficient. His physician, Francesco Antommarchi, had been with him throughout much of his exile, trying various treatments to ease his suffering. But despite the doctor's best efforts, Napoleon's condition only grew worse. There were brief moments when Napoleon seemed to rally, as if his willpower alone could push back against his illness. But these moments were fleeting, and soon he was back in bed, weak and disoriented. In his final days, Napoleon became increasingly reflective. He often spoke to his loyal attendants, expressing his regret for his many mistakes and the choices that had led to his downfall. It was said that he often spoke of his wife Josephine, whom he had loved dearly, but divorced in 1810 in order to marry the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise, in hopes of securing an heir. He spoke of his son, the Duke of Reichstadt, whom he had never seen after his exile, and the son he had hoped would carry on his name and legacy. Napoleon's greatest regret, however, seemed to be the loss of his empire. He had once ruled Europe, and now he was confined to a small, isolated island, awaiting death. Despite his illness, Napoleon's sense of pride never completely disappeared. He continued to insist that he was a man of destiny, that history would remember him as a great leader, regardless of how his life had ended. His companions, though sympathetic, could not help but see the tragic irony in his words. The man who had once shaped the fate of nations now lay helpless on his deathbed, surrounded by those who had once been part of his grand empire, now nothing more than his caretakers. As the days passed, Napoleon became increasingly frail. His mind remained sharp, but his body betrayed him. His once imposing figure, the figure that had once inspired fear and awe, had become thin and weak. His features were gaunt, and his once strong hands, which had once held the reins of power, now trembled as he reached for his medicine. It was clear to all who saw him that the end was near. By May of 1821, it became clear that Napoleon's time was running out. His stomach pain had reached an excruciating level, and he was no longer able to rise from his bed. His once vibrant personality had all but vanished, replaced by a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. His companions, knowing the end was near, gathered around him in his final days, offering what comfort they could. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once conquered Europe, died at the age of 51. His death was not the result of some dramatic final battle or heroic sacrifice, but rather the quiet end of a man who had once held the fate of nations in his hands, only to be brought down by the ravages of time and illness. The news of his death sent shockwaves across Europe, a world that had once been dominated by his ambition and his wars. Napoleon's final days were marked by a sense of tragic irony. He had once been a man of destiny, a man whose ambitions had shaped the course of history. But in the end, he was nothing more than a sick man on an isolated island, far from the empire he had once ruled. His death, though not unexpected, was a reminder of the fragility of life, even for those who seemed destined for greatness. The world that had once been his domain was moving on without him, and the man who had once commanded the world now lay in a humble grave on the island of Saint Helena. His body was quickly prepared for burial. Despite his early requests for a grand tomb, Napoleon was buried in a simple grave, far from the grandeur he had once known. The funeral was a somber affair, attended by only a few of his closest followers. Napoleon had once been surrounded by the finest men of Europe, but in death, he was alone. His once great empire reduced to nothing more than a shadow. The finality of his death marked the end of an era. Napoleon's empire, his ambitions, and his dreams of grandeur were now nothing more than history. His death, though quietly achieved, was a powerful reminder of the fleeting nature of power and the inevitable passage of time. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once ruled much of Europe, was gone, but his legacy whether viewed as a tyrant or a genius, would continue to shape history for centuries to come. As the years passed, Napoleon's legacy became a subject of fascination and debate. Historians and scholars would argue for centuries over the true nature of his character, his achievements, and his impact on the world. Some saw him as a visionary leader, a man who had brought reforms to Europe and spread the ideals of the French Revolution. Others saw him as a ruthless conqueror, whose ambition had led to the deaths of millions and the destruction of an empire. Whatever one's view of Napoleon, his final days on Saint Helena served as a stark reminder of the impermanence of all things. The great emperor, who had once stood at the pinnacle of power, had ended his life in isolation, far from the world he had once known. His legacy, now sealed in history, would be studied and debated for generations to come. But for Napoleon, the story was over. He had fought many battles, but in the end, time had proven to be his greatest adversary. After Napoleon's death, the island of Saint Helena, which had once been his prison, became the site of reflection on the legacy of a man who had shaped Europe's destiny. His funeral, though attended by only a handful of his loyal followers, marked the end of an era. The man who had once been the Emperor of France, who had commanded legions and led nations, was now buried in a simple grave on a remote island, far from the glory he had once known. Yet, despite the somberness of his death, his influence remained. In the immediate aftermath of his passing, the British authorities on Saint Helena ensured that his remains were buried quickly and without ceremony. His funeral was modest, and for a time the island seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the world to react to the death of one of its most powerful figures. Napoleon's once glorious empire had crumbled, and now he was reduced to a quiet, solitary death. But the world did indeed react. News of Napoleon's death spread like wildfire across Europe and beyond. For many, it was the end of an era. Napoleon had been a figure of immense power, and even those who had been his enemies couldn't help but reflect on his impact. His rise from humble beginnings to the heights of imperial power had been nothing short of extraordinary. His fall, too, had been monumental, a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreaching ambition. But in the wake of his death, Europe began to reckon with his legacy. In France, Napoleon's death was met with mixed emotions. For some, he was still the hero who had transformed France into a great power, spreading the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe. For others, he was a tyrant whose wars had devastated the continent and caused the deaths of millions. Napoleon's name, however, was not easily forgotten, and his impact on the nation he had once ruled was undeniable. France, having been shaped by Napoleon's vision and ambition, was left to navigate its future without him. Napoleon's family, too, was affected by his passing. His son, the Duke of Reichstadt, whom Napoleon had hoped would continue his legacy, was left to grow up without the guidance of his father. The young Duke, born from Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria, would never know the empire his father had built, nor would he ever have the opportunity to fulfill the ambitions Napoleon had set for him. His life, marked by the shadow of his father's fall, would be one of quiet tragedy. In the years that followed, Napoleon's supporters and loyalists began to voice their discontent with his treatment after death. Napoleon's remains, initially buried in a humble grave on St. Helena, became the focal point of a growing movement that sought to restore his honor. In 1840, nearly 2 decades after his death, his remains were exhumed and brought back to France in a grand ceremony that would come to symbolize the enduring nature of his legacy. The journey of his body from St. Helena to Paris was one of the most dramatic moments in French history, and the procession that followed was filled with reverence and awe. When Napoleon's body was finally reinterred at Les Invalides in Paris, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of his legacy. His tomb, which became one of the most visited sites in France, symbolized the nation's complicated relationship with their former emperor. Napoleon, whose rise and fall had defined a generation, was now memorialized as both a hero and a symbol of France's imperial past. His memory, despite the controversies and the wars he had waged, had become a cornerstone of French national identity. Despite his death, Napoleon's influence on history continued to resonate. His reforms, particularly in the fields of law, education, and governance had left a lasting imprint on Europe. The Napoleonic Code, which he had instituted during his reign, continued to shape legal systems across the continent and beyond, long after his empire had crumbled. His military tactics, studied in military academies around the world, remained a key part of strategic education. His reign, though brief and tumultuous, had altered the course of European history forever. But it wasn't just his legal and military influence that continued to shape Europe. Napoleon's personality, his drive, his ambition, and his vision of a united Europe lived on in the minds of those who had known him, and in the stories that continued to be told about him. His personal story, full of triumph and tragedy, continued to captivate generations, inspiring countless works of art, literature, and scholarship. Napoleon's life was now more than just the story of a man who had risen to power. He had become a mythic figure, a symbol of both greatness and hubris. While his empire may have fallen, his name lived on, and for many, Napoleon continued to embody the very essence of ambition and power. In the decades that followed, Napoleon's life was re-examined through countless lenses. He was at once a conqueror and a victim, a genius and a tyrant, a man whose vision had changed the world and whose personal flaws had led to his undoing. Napoleon's death on Saint Helena marked the end of an era, but his legacy, complicated, controversial, enduring, remained a powerful force in world history. Even in death, Napoleon continued to captivate the imagination of people across the globe. His final days, spent on a remote island, may have been a far cry from the grandeur of his imperial court, but they were nonetheless a fitting end for a man whose life had been defined by both triumph and tragedy. His passing was not the end of Napoleon Bonaparte, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in the myth of the man who had once ruled the greatest empire Europe had ever known. Though he had been exiled to Saint Helena, Napoleon's spirit seemed to remain an indelible mark on history that would never fade. His name would continue to echo through the halls of history, a reminder of a man whose life, despite its tragic conclusion, had forever changed the course of the world. Napoleon's death, though deeply mourned by some, sparked a new era of reflection, particularly in France, where his legacy became the subject of intense scrutiny and fascination. For many, his passing was not the end, but rather the beginning of a mythic journey that transcended the boundaries of history. The events of his life, filled with both brilliance and folly, continued to be analyzed, celebrated, and criticized in equal measure. Napoleon's influence extended far beyond his immediate circle or the empire he had built. His actions during the Napoleonic Wars had altered the map of Europe, reshaping borders, influencing political structures, and setting the stage for conflicts that would follow in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the decades following his death, Europe began to recover from the devastation wrought by his wars, but the ripple effects of Napoleon's conquests were still felt. The European powers that had once battled against him now faced the challenge of consolidating power and maintaining peace in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. The Congress of Vienna, which took place shortly after Napoleon's exile to Saint Helena, was an attempt by the European powers to restore stability to the continent. The major powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, sought to re-establish the old monarchies that had been upended by Napoleon's conquests. This process of political restoration, however, could not erase the fact that Napoleon had left an indelible mark on Europe's political landscape. The map of Europe had been redrawn, and old alliances had been shattered. The spirit of revolution and nationalism that had been awakened by Napoleon's rise to power would continue to influence Europe's political developments for years to come. The legacy of Napoleon's legal reforms, particularly the Napoleonic Code, was one of his most enduring contributions. The code, which Napoleon had established in 1804, became a model for legal systems not only in France, but in many countries around the world. Its emphasis on equality before the law, the protection of property rights, and the establishment of clear legal processes had a lasting impact on the development of modern legal systems. In many ways, the Napoleonic Code represented Napoleon's most profound and lasting achievement, one that transcended his military conquests and imperial ambitions. As the 19th century unfolded, Napoleon's influence continued to shape the development of European nations. His vision of a united Europe, while never fully realized, resonated with later generations of political leaders. The idea of a united Europe, where nations could collaborate for mutual benefit, would eventually lead to the formation of the European Union in the 20th century. Though Napoleon's methods were often dictatorial, his idea of unity and cooperation between nations found new life in the diplomatic efforts of the post-World War II era. In France, Napoleon remained a controversial figure, revered by some and reviled by others. His supporters, known as Bonapartists, continued to champion his legacy, advocating for the restoration of the Bonaparte family to the throne. Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, would eventually rise to power as Napoleon III, Emperor of France, continuing the Bonaparte dynasty. His reign, though marked by some successes, could never fully recapture the glory of his uncle's empire. The political climate in France remained unstable, and the question of Napoleon's legacy continued to shape political discourse long after his death. For many years, Napoleon was seen by some as a symbol of the French Revolution's ideals, particularly in terms of his role in spreading the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity across Europe. His revolutionary reforms, particularly in areas such as education and the legal system, were viewed as a continuation of the revolutionary ideals that had swept through France in 1789. However, his actions during his reign, his expansionist wars, his establishment of a dynastic empire, and his authoritarian rule were seen by others as a betrayal of the revolution's core principles. In the years following his death, historians and writers began to explore Napoleon's character in greater depth. Some saw him as a tragic hero, a man whose brilliance and ambition had been undone by his own flaws. Others viewed him as a tyrant who had destroyed countless lives in his pursuit of power. Yet, despite the many conflicting views of Napoleon's character, one thing was clear: his impact on history could not be denied. He had transformed the face of Europe, and his name would forever be associated with both greatness and destruction. As the years passed, the fascination with Napoleon only grew. His story was told and retold in countless books, plays, and films, each new generation finding its own interpretation of his life. In the 20th century, Napoleon became a figure of both admiration and criticism, depending on the perspective from which he was viewed. For some, he was the embodiment of genius and ambition, a man who had reshaped the world in his own image. For others, he was a symbol of unchecked power, a man who had sacrificed countless lives in the pursuit of glory. Napoleon's legacy continued to inspire a wide range of political movements, from conservative monarchists who saw him as a champion of order and authority, to revolutionary movements that viewed his actions as a betrayal of the principles of the French Revolution. Even in the 21st century, Napoleon's influence can be seen in the political discourse of modern Europe, where his ideas about law, governance, and European unity continue to resonate. In the centuries after his death, the question of how to interpret Napoleon's legacy remained a matter of intense debate. Was he a visionary leader, a man who sought to bring about a new world order? Or was he simply a power-hungry dictator who used war and violence to achieve his goals? His impact on history is undeniable, but the legacy of his rule remains a subject of controversy. His reign may have ended in failure, but his story continues to captivate the imagination of people around the world. Despite the tragedies of his life, his fall from power, his exile, and his death on a remote island, Napoleon's story is far from over. His legacy, shaped by his rise and fall, remains one of the most compelling and debated narratives in world history. The name of Napoleon Bonaparte will forever be etched in the annals of time, a reminder of a man who changed the course of history, for better or for worse. Napoleon's story is a powerful testament to the complexities of human ambition. His desire for greatness and his quest for power shaped his life, but it also ultimately led to his downfall. And yet, despite the many contradictions in his character, his influence on the world cannot be understated. His final years on Saint Helena may have been marked by physical decline and isolation, but the story of his rise, his empire, and his enduring legacy continues to resonate throughout history. Napoleon, the man who had once been the most powerful figure in Europe, will forever be remembered as one of history's most fascinating and complex figures. As the years passed and the legend of Napoleon continued to evolve, it became clear that his story was far from being a mere footnote in history. His life, marked by grandeur, ambition, and eventual downfall, embodied the complexities of power, the fragility of empires, and the relentless march of time. Napoleon's final years, spent in the lonely exile on Saint Helena, may have been filled with isolation and illness, but his legacy was far from extinguished. The man who had shaped the destiny of Europe, who had left an indelible mark on the course of history, would live on in the hearts and minds of millions for generations to come. Napoleon's death was not the end of his influence, but rather the beginning of a process by which his legacy would be contested, romanticized, and eventually immortalized. His tomb, now located in Paris at Les Invalides, became a place of pilgrimage for many. It served not only as a symbol of his remarkable achievements, but also as a constant reminder of his ultimate failure. Napoleon's tomb was a reflection of the paradoxes of his character. A man who had been both a conqueror and a prisoner, a reformer and a dictator, a visionary and a tyrant. His life, it seemed, was a mirror to the tumultuous history of the 19th century itself. In France, the Bonapartist movement, which had continued after his death, saw periods of revival, particularly during the rise of Napoleon III, his nephew. Napoleon III's ascent to power as the ruler of France in the mid-19th century seemed, to some, a continuation of his uncle's legacy, though their methods and ideologies differed significantly. Napoleon III sought to restore the grandeur of the Napoleonic Empire in a more moderate form, but his reign too ended in failure. His defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and the collapse of the Second French Empire cemented the idea that the Bonaparte dynasty, despite its occasional resurgence, could not reclaim the glory of Napoleon's reign. Yet, even after the fall of Napoleon III, Napoleon Bonaparte's name continued to resonate across Europe and beyond. His impact on military strategy, governance, and legal systems ensured that his legacy would endure in various forms. Military academies around the world continued to study his campaigns, analyzing his tactical genius and the lessons to be learned from his rise and fall. His revolutionary ideas about law and governance, particularly the Napoleonic Code, influenced legal systems in countries far beyond France, from Latin America to the Middle East, leaving a lasting imprint on the legal frameworks of modern nations. Historians and writers continue to grapple with the complexities of Napoleon's character and legacy. To some, he remained a hero, a man who had revolutionized the political landscape of Europe and introduced sweeping reforms that had reshaped entire societies. His supporters saw him as a force for progress, someone who had brought order to a continent fractured by war and revolution. To others, however, he was a tyrant, a man who had pursued his own ambitions at the expense of countless lives, whose wars of conquest had left Europe in ruins. His personal flaws, particularly his insatiable desire for power and control, were seen by many as the root of his eventual downfall. Napoleon's life, filled with contradictions, was also marked by his obsession with his legacy. In his final days on Saint Helena, he reportedly declared that history would vindicate him, that time would reveal the greatness of his rule. This statement, whether uttered in defiance or resignation, would prove to be prophetic in its own way. Over the years, the perception of Napoleon shifted, with each new generation interpreting his actions through the lens of their own values and struggles. His legacy was not static, it was constantly evolving, reshaped by political and historical circumstances. In the 20th century, the fascination with Napoleon reached new heights. His life became the subject of numerous biographies, documentaries, and films. His image, once that of a proud and powerful ruler, was often depicted as tragic, a man whose ambition had ultimately led to his isolation and demise. This portrayal resonated with a world that had seen the rise and fall of many powerful leaders, some who, like Napoleon, had been brought low by their own hubris. The world wars of the 20th century also contributed to the enduring fascination with Napoleon. His military genius, his ability to command vast armies and conquer territories, was often compared to that of modern military leaders. In a century dominated by global conflict, Napoleon's story became a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ambition, while also serving as a reminder of the potential for greatness that could emerge from even the most unlikely of circumstances. The modern era, Napoleon's legacy continues to be a subject of both reverence and critique. Some view him as a champion of the common people, a leader who had fought for the ideals of the French Revolution, even as he established his own empire. Others see him as a dictator whose personal ambition and quest for power led to war, devastation, and the loss of countless lives. His image, though shrouded in myth, remains a powerful symbol of both the triumphs and the tragedies that marked his life. Napoleon's legacy also extends beyond the realm of politics and war. His name has become synonymous with ambition, with the drive to achieve greatness against all odds. He has been the subject of countless works of art, literature, and music, his image often romanticized, his character dissected, and his actions reinterpreted. His rise from a modest Corsican background to the heights of imperial power has inspired generations of individuals to pursue their own ambitions, while his ultimate fall serves as a reminder of the dangers of overreaching. As we look back on Napoleon's life, we are reminded of the complexities of human ambition. His story is one of brilliance and folly, of triumph and defeat. He was a man who changed the course of history, for better or for worse, and whose legacy continues to influence the world in ways both seen and unseen. His final years on Saint Helena, spent in isolation and suffering, may have marked the end of his life, but they also mark the beginning of a legend that will be shaped by history, myth, and memory. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once ruled Europe with an iron fist, may have died far from the glory he had once known. But his story did not end on St. Helena. His legacy, complex and multifaceted, would continue to live on in the hearts and minds of generations to come. He remains, to this day, one of the most fascinating and enigmatic figures in world history. His life, his rise, his fall, and the myths that surround him will continue to captivate the world for centuries to come. The final days of Napoleon Bonaparte may have been marked by illness, isolation, and regret, but the story of his life, filled with ambition, brilliance, and tragedy, will forever remain one of history's most compelling narratives. Napoleon's death was not the end of his influence, but the beginning of a legacy that would shape the world long after his passing.